Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Genius Scan and Monday.com. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, back from the beach, Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John, and I'm happy to be back. I'm not sure if I still know how to do a podcast, though.
It's been a little while, hasn't it?
All I know is how to surf, and no, that's not really true.
No, you didn't do any
I don't surf. I don't do any surfing. I just I lie on the beach and, read some books. I read a book while on vacation. Dark Age by our friend Pierce Brown. But otherwise, I just relaxed and chilled and recharged my batteries because September's coming up. There's a lot of new stuff happening in the Apple world, so gotta be ready.
Yep, time to start the last-minute sprint. Well, if you've forgotten how to record a podcast, I do have a backup plan, and that's I got Casey Liss on the show a couple of weeks ago, and it was really more of an audition than it was a guest appearance. So I told him,
oh, really?
I told him if things come apart with you, that he's first in line. So we've got Casey on tap.
You tell him we'll be in touch.
Yes, we'll be. My people will call him if need be. So.
To tell you the truth, John, I'm so behind on podcasts, including mine. So I got those two episodes of App Stories in my queue in the podcasts app, because that's what I've been using because it's iOS review season. So I gotta use Apple's app until I eventually go back to Overcast. Maybe we'll see.
All right.
So I'm behind on podcasts. I'm behind on RSS. I'm behind on a bunch of stuff.
I bet you are.
I just what I did was I read a book. Listened to the new Bon Iver album like 12 times in a row, and I played with my dogs at the beach. So that was good.
That sounds great. Well, we covered CarPlay in your absence with Casey, which was good because I don't think you probably have a lot to say about that anyway, since you don't have a CarPlay car.
No, I don't. So.
And Ryan helped out with Apple Maps because he did our special story on Mac Stories about that, so I figured he would be perfect for that. And we had a good chat about maps. But today, I want to talk to you about something that I know you've been using, and I have too, and I wrote about on the site not that long ago, which is Sidecar on macOS.
Yeah.
And it's one of those features that's not really a Mac feature or an iPad feature. It's really both, because you need to have both Catalina and iOS 13 installed. Are you using it while you record this?
Not right now, but I've used it because my iPad is charging in the other room, and I forgot to pick it up. But I've used it for my other shows before leaving for vacation. I tested Sidecar for a couple of weeks instead of my previous setup, which was built using Luna Display and a bunch of automations with Keyboard Maestro and Better Touch Tool. I've been using Sidecar instead for that. And I will probably go back to using it, for next week's shows. So I'm familiar with it. I'm running Catalina on my Mac Mini. I've been using Catalina on this computer for the past 3 betas, I think. So it's been about a month, really, and it's been fine for me. Then again, I don't develop software on my Mac Mini. I just use it for basic stuff. But I've been using it. And now you mentioned. We wrote about Sidecar on Mac Stories. Ryan wrote about Maps on Mac Stories. We have a whole collection of iOS and watchOS, upcoming stories on upcoming features of those OSs, which you can find. There's going to be a link in the show notes to get to this sort of a hub on Mac Stories where you will find all of these previews that we've been doing ahead of my iOS 13 and iPadOS 13 review. You will be able to see all of these stories, and who knows, maybe eventually these stories will be collected in a sort of a single file format. We'll see. So there's a bunch of stuff on Mac Stories this summer to keep you occupied while waiting for iOS.
Yeah, it's been fun to do those, and we've still got more coming. I mean, we've done a few now, and we've got at least, I think, at least 3 more to go. So keep an eye out for those, because I think we'll have one drop just about every week between now and the release of iOS 13. All right, so Federico, just to kind of set the stage for Sidecar, in case anybody doesn't know exactly what it does, it's just a really amazingly simple feature for using your iPad as a second screen for your Mac. And the first time I tried it, and this was on a pretty early beta of both iOS and macOS, I was really impressed with just how simple it is to use, because there are a few ways you can initiate a Sidecar session, but you can do it either wired using either a USB-C cable to like an iPad Pro, or using a Lightning cable to a different type of iPad. Like I've used my Mini with it, which is kind of a fun and weird experience with that little tiny iPad. But I was impressed with exactly how easy it is to get it started, and also how quick it is and how little the latency is. It only works within about a 10-meter radius around your Mac. So this isn't like a thing where you're going to roam all over your house necessarily, or use it, off your local network. It has to be within a relatively short space. But I've found using it that as long as I'm in the same room, it's totally fine. And one of the things that I do a lot is I have my Mac set up on kind of a corner desk, and I've got a table that runs perpendicular to that. And that table I use a lot for special projects like doing photography, but I also use it sometimes use it with my iPad Pro, where my Mac's over at the other desk and I sit at this separate spot for using my iPad. And it's just really nice to be able to have my Mac screen available, even if my back's turned to my main display that I usually use with my Mac. So, I mean, we'll get a little bit into the use cases in a little bit, but it's as simple to get started as going to the AirPlay menu item in the Mac and just picking the name of your iPad out of that list. You can also start it from system preferences, but that's really all you have to do. There's usually a little flash of your Mac screen where it just does like a little blink, and then it's on both. It's pretty amazing. Now, have you found it to be easy to get going?
Actually, at first I sort of struggled to find where the Sidecar activation menu was, because I didn't think of checking in the AirPlay dropdown in the menu bar, because it's not labeled as Sidecar. And I knew, like, no, I don't want to AirPlay. I want to connect via Sidecar. And so I ended up opening system preferences and searching Sidecar because I couldn't even see the icon or something, I think. So, but then I realized, I think by reading your overview on Mac Stories, that it was also baked into the AirPlay dropdown. So it's easy enough to get going once you know where it is. I just sort of wish that it was its own item in the menu bar at least. Or if there was, maybe somebody will come up with a script or something with some kind of automation that you can assign a keyboard shortcut to and connect to your iPad.
Yeah, that would definitely be nice. So you can do it from the AirPlay menu, like I mentioned, but you can also do it, as Federico said, from the Sidecar system preference pane or from the displays preference pane. But there's two spots in preferences to do that. So those are the ways to get started. And then, interacting with it, it's just like having a second display. You've got the ability to have all your Mac apps over on your iPad, and one thing that Apple has added is if you go to that green stoplight button, for lack of a better term, in the upper left corner of any window, if you hover over it, you'll see a drop down, and the drop down allows you to move that window to your Sidecar iPad. So all you have to do is select that, and it just pops right over to the iPad. It actually, that feature works not just with Sidecar, but with any external display. So, for instance, if you have a MacBook Pro that's open with the display open, and you have an external display with that, you can use the same thing to move it to the external display. It works either way. You can only have one iPad connected to Sidecar with Sidecar at a time. You can't have multiple iPads. I did try that. You can have,
of course,
you can have an iPad, an external display, and a Mac display. So however many external displays your Mac supports, and that may be one, that may be two, whatever it happens to be, you can have that number of external hardwired displays plus one Sidecar iPad. So I was at one point running my MacBook Pro with the display open and active, an external 4K display, plus my iPad. Now, I don't really expect to be using that on a regular basis, but I do think it's kind of cool that you could, then I had my, finger on the trackpad and I was moving my pointer from the external display to the Mac all the way over to the iPad, and it was one continuous set of screen that I had available to me, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's one of the best features of being able to extend the Mac's display to an iPad. You get this weird illusion of you have a monitor and you see the mouse and you see the macOS interface, but it's actually an iPad. And I guess one of the things that sets Sidecar apart from other solutions that we've seen before, whether it's Luna Display or Duet or other, there's a bunch of display mirroring apps on the App Store that you can try. What sets it apart is that Apple itself is taking advantage of this integration between the Mac and the iPad. And so you have like this, we're going to talk about it, but you have this special sort of a sidebar on the iPad screen for the key modifiers for keyboard shortcuts. And you have the touch bar controls baked into Sidecar on the iPad. There's an illusion that it's an external display, but it's also very much an iPad in the sense that it takes advantage of the fact that it's a computer, like a separate computer running a separate app, to bring forth some new features that third parties cannot access.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Monday.com, the tool that simplifies the way teams work together. With Monday.com, not only can you manage work and deadlines, you can also cultivate a culture of transparency so everyone in your company works better together. There are a lot of great things about Monday.com. It works great for teams of any size, from a couple of freelancers to a huge team. Since I've begun using Monday.com, I've been surprised and delighted to find that it works for everything from our small team here at Mac Stories on up to big companies. It's also super easy to use. You can automate workflows, build a board from scratch, or use pre-made templates, which are a great way to get up to speed quickly. And you can upload files directly from your computer, Dropbox, or Google Drive. Monday.com helps you stay on track. You can create accountability by assigning tasks to owners, and you'll never miss a deadline with the My Week View, a personal assistant for you and your team. There's also an iOS app so you can work on the go, too. I'm new to Monday.com, and I've really liked what I've seen so far, especially the ability to view projects in a whole bunch of different ways. There's support for project timelines, Kanban-style card views, more spreadsheet-like tables, and a whole lot more. I've been using the timeline to view and help me visualize the Mac Stories fall editorial calendar. You can try it too by going to monday.com/appstories to start a 14-day free trial. That's monday.com/appstories for your 14-day free trial to monday.com. Go there right now and try it out. I think you'll love it. Our thanks to Monday.com for their support of App Stories. This is more than just extending your display. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you can extend your display, as we've already talked about. You can also mirror your display if you'd rather do that, which I guess is a good way to just work on your Mac away from your Mac within the same room, or to demonstrate something to someone. You could hand them your iPad and then do something on your Mac and they can see what you're working on. That's another option, but I haven't found myself really using that very much. But as you said, the fact that you have it's an iPad and not just an external display means it's got its own smarts. So there's all kinds of things that makes possible. And before we get into the special aspects of Sidecar and the sidebar and the touch bar, the interactions are interesting to me because they're a little different than dealing with your iPad on a normal basis, because it just has to deal with the fact that you're using Mac software on an iPad. So the Apple Pencil is supported and Touch is supported, but it's all a little bit different in that you cannot tap targets like a button, for instance, with just a single finger, and you cannot use single finger swipe to scroll a Safari page, for example. Instead, you can tap with the pencil. The pencil is, the precision pointing device that allows you to interact with UI elements in a Mac app. And then in terms of scrolling, it's a two-finger scroll gesture. It's not, you can't use the pencil to scroll like you would if you were in Safari on the iPad. So it's a little different, and that takes a little bit of getting used to. But it's really accommodating for the differences between a Mac and an iPad more than anything else, I think.
Yeah. It reminds me that the two finger scrolling, I think it was the same behavior in Screens, the VNC client
Right.
for iOS.
Right.
And every time I used it on my iPad, and before sort of moving to the iPad Pro as my main computer, I used to do this a lot. I would access my Mac remotely via VNC using Screens, and every time there was this odd disconnect of expectations between on my iPad I scroll with one finger, but then when I was using VNC and I was controlling the Mac's interface via the iPad, I needed to scroll with two fingers. So it's always been this strange. And it's very much an uncanny valley situation of it sort of looks like a Mac, but it's not really a Mac. And it's, the feeling of strangeness is compounded by the fact that the iPad has its own interactions. So it requires some adjustments. But I think because my primary use of Sidecar and in general of the iPad as an external monitor is mostly in a fixed position. Like I just want to see some windows at my desk while I'm working with the Mac Mini to do podcasts. I don't need to interact with the iPad necessarily, and it's fine for that. So basically, instead of buying an additional 4K monitor, I can just use my existing iPad Pro, but I don't actually use the iPad Pro as a gateway to the macOS UI, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. I mean, I'll tell you though, if you use this side by side with something like a MacBook Pro 13-inch, you very quickly reach out and touch the screen of the MacBook because that's what I was doing during a lot of the testing. And the screens are almost identically sized. And if you put them next to each other, especially if you put an iPad Pro 12.9 into like a bridge keyboard, and you put those two side by side, you can barely tell them apart at this point. I mean, there's no trackpad on the bridge keyboard, and there's some other subtle differences. But when you're in Sidecar mode, using a keyboard like that, it looks like a touchscreen Mac. It's very much that sort of feeling. Before we get to the sidebar and stuff too, I should mention how keyboards work, because the Sidecar, because it's displaying the dimensions of your display, I guess, it doesn't work in split view. So it's always taking up the whole screen. And as a result, also, you don't get that, you don't have access to the keyboard, the software keyboard of the iPad that, comes up from the bottom and kind of pushes up the window. That doesn't work either. Instead, in that sidebar, you've got a keyboard button. And if you tap it, you get a little tiny keyboard that you can use that's a lot like an iPhone keyboard in terms of the size. And it's not, you're not going to write in that because it's this tiny little keyboard that you can move anywhere on the screen on the iPad. But it's great for just, really small interactions. It's totally fine. Where it really shines, though, is if you have any kind of keyboard connected. So that includes the smart keyboard folio that connects with the smart connector, or a Bluetooth keyboard. Any keyboard that works with the iPad that I tried works with Sidecar. So once you're connected to that keyboard, the inputs from that keyboard go straight into the Mac software. So you don't have to worry about doing anything special to make that happen. And that's where you start realizing the possibilities for what this can mean for the iPad, because you're working in Sidecar and you're using your keyboard and you're working in a Mac app. But then say you need to go to another app and it's an iPad app, you just, command tab over, or however you want to get to it, bring up the dock and work in that. And then you can go right back to Sidecar because it doesn't lose the connection when you switch to another app. It's there and it's active. So you can go back and forth between the two. And especially with things like, I guess, the universal clipboard and other ways that you can interact between a Mac and an iOS device, whether it's AirDrop or the universal clipboard or whatever, allows you to work a lot more seamlessly from one device to the other. And that's where I started feeling like I had this combination device where, it was an iPad, yes, but it also, I had access to any of the Mac apps that I wanted.
Yeah. But of course, it's only, the only multitasking mode that's supported in Sidecar is slide over, not split view.
Right.
So I sort of understand why, because otherwise the Mac's interface would be too small.
Right.
Or maybe, maybe when a 16-inch iPad Pro comes out, maybe you will be able to have a split view with on one side macOS and on the other side some other iPad OS app. I don't know. What you mentioned about the universal clipboard, and I would also mention AirDrop, for example. All of these features that make it easy to exchange data and links or files between iOS and iPadOS devices. I think they also very much enable these new use cases where the iPad is a monitor for a Mac. I've been doing this with the Luna display, and it works just as well with Sidecar. You can just AirDrop things to yourself, and you get this sort of this again very odd experience of, for example, you have files in Slide Over or Safari in Slide Over on your iPad, and you share via AirDrop, and on the other side of the screen, you see an AirDrop confirmation dialog, but it's coming from a different platform, even though you're actually interacting with it. And it's very strange, but it totally works.
Yeah, it works really well. I've found that a lot of the continuity features have been more solid over time. I've had fewer problems with them than I used to. So I find myself I've used the universal clipboard a lot in the past anyway, when I'm doing something on my phone and need to move an image or a link or something to my Mac. And when now that you can use Sidecar, it's pretty neat. I mean, the other thing that's a little weird about Sidecar is that it's kind of an app on the iPad, but it's not really. I had a lot of fun messing around with this because when you switch out of Sidecar, you'll see it sitting down there in your recent apps, part of the dock on the iPad. And there's an icon. It's like a overlapping Mac and iPad icon, and it's blue. But you can't put you won't find it anywhere on any home screen. You can't put it there. You can't open it. You can't drag it and open it in split view. There's really a lot of things you can't do with it other than switch back to it. It's really there to enable switching back to it more than anything else, which is. I guess it reminds me a little bit about remember that weird print feature from way back in the iPad, that print app that was there for like a split second.
What was it called? Like print.
I don't even remember.
A name.
Yeah,
it was a name like not Print Central, but something like that, Print Station or something. Maybe it was just AirPrint. I don't know.
Maybe, but it was kind of funny, but it's maybe a little bit like that. And I'd like to see it become a full-fledged app too, because, right now you can only initiate Sidecar from your Mac. And this is one thing that I noticed right away when I started using Sidecar on my iPad with my back turned to the Mac, which was, I had to turn around to go connect Sidecar up with the iPad. And, that's not that big of a hassle, but it would be nice to be able to initiate Sidecar from the iPad too. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Genius Scan. Genius Scan is just like a document scanner, but in your pocket. Have you ever needed to scan a document while you were away from home? Well, that's what Genius Scan is for. All you have to do is place the document in front of your device's camera, and Genius Scan automatically recognizes the paper against its background, crops it, cleans up the result, and what you have is a crisp, legible scan every time. Multiple pages are automatically gathered into a single PDF document that makes it super easy and more convenient to share and archive what you scanned. Regularly featured by Apple and with an average star rating of 4.9 on the App Store, Genius Scan has been continuously updated and improved since 2010. For instance, this fall, Genius Scan is going to support dark mode on iOS as soon as iOS 13 is out. Genius Scan is great for all kinds of users too. Students use it for scanning notes and doctors' prescriptions. Pilots scan their airline documentation, truckers scan paperwork, and salespeople use it to scan contracts when they're on the go. It can handle all of that and so much more. Genius Scan is totally free and fully functional. You can unlock additional features like background, export to Dropbox and Google Drive, OCR, Touch ID locking, and PDF encryption, as well as smart document naming for an in-app purchase that's just $7.99. You can also optionally subscribe to their Genius Cloud service for backup and synchronization between devices. Genius Scan is doing a giveaway just for our listeners. Just go to geniusscan.com/appstories and enter your email address for a chance to win one of 10 promo codes for the app's in-app purchase, which will be randomly selected. Be sure to go to the show notes, too, to download a copy of Genius Scan today. Genius Scan, a scanner in your pocket. Our thanks to Genius Scan for their support of App Stories.
So how do you use it? Besides, I don't know, do you use it while recording podcasts? Or do you actually use it because you want to have macOS on your iPad?
I would say the majority of the time I use it as just a traditional second display. So the kinds of things like you mentioned, where it's, all right, I have this big display and I'm got my show notes in front of me and recording a podcast, and I'd like to have, say, audio hijack on the iPad so I can keep an eye on the time and make sure it's recording, that kind of thing. So I use it like that most of the time. But I've also just been finding myself wanting to, for instance, find a file in the Finder sometimes. And so if I'm at my desk and using the iPad, sometimes I'll just connect Sidecar so that it's there in case I need anything on the Mac and I can find it without leaving the iPad, because it just makes the experience a little more fluid. It's less of an interruption to have to then, go to the Mac, find what I'm looking for, and do it that way. I mean, that's worked pretty well so far. So I'll usually keep, Finder and maybe a couple of other things open on the iPad and have that available to me as well.
Mm-hmm. The main thing that I'm considering right now is, because I don't foresee having to work on the iPad Pro by accessing macOS, especially now that I have, I wrote an article last year on how I was using the Luna display to access some macOS features that were not available on the iPad. And so things like better file management and being able to open zip files or downloading files from Safari, all that kind of stuff, I came up with this workaround and all of these shortcuts to access macOS from my iPad Pro, use it through Luna Display, and then have some shortcuts or automations that would transfer those files back to my iPad. But now that I have iPad OS and I have a downloader in Safari, I got multiple columns in files. I can open zip files in the file manager. I don't feel the need to actually use macOS as much. And so I'm going back to my original sort of problem of I just need macOS when I'm recording podcasts and I want to put the iPad next to me. And because I'm extremely nitpicky when it comes to setting up my workstation to record podcasts, I got to rethink the automation that I had to do a bunch of things all at once. So once the iPad was connected, I want to have a workflow that triggers on my Mac Mini, opens a bunch of apps, moves their windows to the iPad in, using exact coordinates, to put them one in the upper left corner and another in the bottom right corner and stuff like that. It needs to open a specific Google Doc page in Safari, and it needs to start a timer on Toggle, and it needs to set the lights of the bedroom to a specific color depending on the show that I'm recording. So it's a bunch of, I'm a little particular like that when it comes to my ideal podcasting setup. To be fair, I think I'm justified because I do 6 podcasts. So I think I'm allowed to be a little particular about my taste. I gotta see how much Sidecar can be scripted. I assume that apps will be able to see it as an external display. I know that Keyboard Maestro and Better Touch Tool on the Mac have actions to interact with external displays and do things like move this window to this monitor at these X and Y coordinates. So that's what I gotta rethink, because I'm assuming that my old solution based on the Luna display is not gonna translate necessarily well to Sidecar. So my experience with Sidecar will be largely dictated by how much I can automate connections and window positioning, because that's what I do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think another thing that I'm going to try to use it with, and I haven't really done this yet though, is when I'm writing about a Mac app, the ability to be able to do that writing in something like IA Writer on my iPad but switch back to the Mac app using Sidecar just for reference to try something out quickly and then go back to writing in iWriter makes a lot of sense to me. Even doing things like screenshots and then editing them in something like Pixelmator Pro, because Pixelmator Photo on iOS lost the ability to do certain things like layered images that you can crop and that sort of thing. I mean, it has cropping, but it doesn't have layering and that sort of thing. So there are uses for things like Pixelmator Pro that I do on the Mac that I can't do on iOS as easily. So that would be available. And, you could argue that I should just do what I've always done, which is when I'm writing about a Mac app, I usually write on my Mac because that's just easier because I can go back and forth and reference the app there. But I like to be able to write on the iPad. It's really, there are fewer distractions there. There's less clutter a lot of the time. And I just like to mix it up and have the opportunity to use the iPad, even if I'm doing something that's writing about the Mac. All right, Federico, that is a good place to stop, I think. I'm really looking forward to Sidecar this fall. I mean, I've already been using it quite a bit, and I think once we're at the point where this is on my main machine, because as I think I've mentioned in the past, right now it's just on on my laptop, which is a secondary machine. But once it's on my main Mac, I expect I'll be using this quite a bit in the future. So I want to thank our two sponsors again. That's Genius Scan and Monday.com. We'll be back again next week. You can find me and Federico writing over at macstories.net. Federico is over on Twitter and Instagram. He's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.